On a spring morning in 1943, German fighter pilots stationed along the English Channel watched a new shape emerge from the clouds over occupied France. The aircraft was enormous, nearly twice the size of anything they had seen before, with a fat, round nose and a body that bulged like a bottle. The pilots laughed. One radioed to his wingman that the Americans had sent flying milk jugs to fight the Luftwaffe. They called it crude, ungainly, and hopelessly outmatched against the sleek Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that ruled European skies. Within 2 years, that same aircraft would destroy over 3,500 of their planes and help bring the Third Reich to its knees 7,000 miles away in a small design office on Long Island, New York. A Georgian immigrant named Alexander Kartveli had already anticipated this reaction. He knew his creation looked nothing like a fighter should look. He knew the experts would call it a dinosaur. But Kartveli understood something the Germans did not. In a war of attrition, survival mattered more than elegance, and the machine he had built was very, very hard to kill. The Germans believed the Americans could not build a true fighter aircraft. They were about to learn how catastrophically wrong they were. The contempt began before the first encounter. German intelligence had studied American aviation throughout the 1930s and found little to respect. American aircraft were designed for civilian use, for carrying passengers and mail across vast distances. They prioritized comfort over combat capability, range over firepower, and reliability over raw performance. The fighters America did produce seemed adequate for defending distant coastlines, but hardly suitable for the brutal close-quarters combat that defined air warfare over Europe. Luftwaffe pilots had spent years honing their skills against the best the Royal Air Force could offer. They had fought Spitfires and Hurricanes, aircraft designed by nations with centuries of military tradition. They had developed tactics, doctrine, and an almost mystical confidence in their superiority. The German pilot training program was the most rigorous in the world, producing aviators with hundreds of flight hours before they ever saw combat. These men had conquered the skies over Poland, France, and the Low Countries. They had nearly broken Britain during the Battle of Britain. They did not fear whatever the Americans might send against them. The technical assessments reinforced this confidence. German engineers examined photographs and specifications of American aircraft and found them wanting. The planes were too heavy, too slow, and too cumbersome for the kind of dogfighting that decided aerial combat. American factories might produce aircraft in great numbers, but quantity could not compensate for quality. 100 mediocre fighters were worth less than 10 superb ones in the hands of skilled pilots. This was the doctrine that had built the Luftwaffe, and it had never failed them. Hermann Göring, commander of the German Air Force, embodied this contempt. He had built the Luftwaffe from nothing into the most feared aerial armada in history. He understood what it took to produce combat aircraft, the precision engineering, the specialized materials, the years of experience required to train skilled workers. The Americans had none of these advantages. Their aviation industry built transports and trainers. The notion that they could suddenly produce fighters capable of challenging German designs struck him as laughable. This analysis contained a fatal flaw. The Germans measured American potential by American peacetime production. They saw factories making transport planes and trainers and concluded these factories could not produce world-class fighters. They observed that America had stayed out of the European war and assumed this meant Americans lacked the will to fight effectively. They looked at the diversity of American society and believed it would fracture under pressure. They failed to understand what happens when American industry decides to solve a problem. The transformation began in the mind of one man. Alexander Kartveli had arrived in America in 1927 as a penniless immigrant.
Born in Falaise, Georgia in 1896, he had studied aeronautical engineering in Paris at the École supérieure d'aéronautique. While completing his studies, Kartveli supported himself by performing as a circus trapeze artist, developing the physical courage and spatial awareness that would later inform his aircraft designs. When American millionaire Charles Levine invited him to head engineering for an aircraft venture, Kartveli seized the opportunity to escape the economic hardship of post-war Europe.
He joined Seversky Aircraft in 1931, working alongside fellow Georgian immigrant Alexander Seversky. The two men shared a vision of high-performance aircraft built around powerful engines and advanced aerodynamics. When the company reorganized as Republic Aviation in 1939 following financial difficulties, Kartveli became chief designer with virtually unlimited authority to pursue his concepts. Kartveli approached aircraft design differently than his European counterparts. European designers started with the airframe and fitted the engine to match. Kartveli started with the mission and worked backward. When intelligence from the European Air War demonstrated that Republic's original lightweight fighter concept was inadequate against Luftwaffe aircraft, Kartveli did not try to improve it incrementally. He threw it away entirely and started over. The key insight came during a train ride from Wright Field back to New York. Kartveli realized that high-altitude performance would decide the air war over Europe. American heavy bombers like the B-17 and B-24 flew at 25,000 feet and higher to stay above most anti-aircraft fire. Fighters that could not reach those altitudes and fight effectively were useless as escorts. The solution was a turbo supercharger, a device that compressed thin, high-altitude air to maintain engine power where normally aspirated engines would gasp and fail. But the turbo supercharger system was enormous. Unlike the compact superchargers used on European fighters, the American turbo supercharger required an exhaust-driven turbine that needed complex ducting running the entire length of the fuselage. The intake air had to travel from the nose to the rear of the aircraft, through the compressor and back to the engine. The exhaust gases had to take a similar journey in reverse. The plumbing alone would weigh hundreds of pounds, so Kartveli made a radical decision. He would design the turbo supercharger installation first and build the airplane around it. The result would be massive, the largest single-engine fighter ever built. It would weigh more than twice as much as a Messerschmitt 109. It would look like nothing else in the sky. It will be a dinosaur, Kartveli reportedly told his team, but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions. The aircraft that emerged from Republic's Farmingdale factory justified both the skepticism and the confidence. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a monster by any measure. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine displaced approximately 2,800 cubic inches across 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows of 9. It produced 2,000 horsepower in its initial configuration, more than any fighter engine in the world. Later variants with water injection boosted this to 2,300 horsepower and beyond. The engine alone weighed over 2,000 pounds and measured over 52 inches in diameter. The turbo supercharger system that made this power useful at altitude was an engineering marvel of the highest order. Air entered through a scoop beneath the cowling, traveled 43 feet through ducting to a General Electric compressor in the rear fuselage, and then returned to the engine through an intercooler that prevented the compressed air from overheating. Exhaust gases traveled 19 feet through separate ducting to spin the turbine wheel at speeds exceeding 20,000 revolutions per minute. This ducting glowed cherry red during full power operation, a sight that alarmed new pilots until they learned it was normal.
The complexity delivered exactly what Kartveli had promised. The Thunderbolt maintained sea-level engine power to approximately 27,000 feet, an altitude where other fighters had lost nearly half their performance. It could operate effectively above 40,000 feet, reaching a service ceiling of 42,000 feet in optimal conditions. At these altitudes, the P-47 could dive on enemy fighters that could neither catch it nor escape it. The armament matched the airframe's scale and exceeded anything else in the sky. 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, delivered the heaviest volume of fire of any American single-engine fighter. Each gun fired approximately 800 rounds per minute. Together, they put out 6,400 rounds per minute, a hurricane of steel core bullets that could tear apart any aircraft in seconds. Ammunition capacity of 425 rounds per gun in late production models meant pilots could fire for nearly 30 seconds continuously, an eternity in aerial combat, where most engagements lasted only seconds. The .50 caliber round itself was a devastating projectile. Achieving muzzle velocities approaching 2,900 feet per second, it could penetrate nearly an inch of hardened steel armor at close range. Against aircraft skin and structure, the effects were catastrophic. A single hit could sever control cables, rupture fuel lines, or kill the pilot. 8 guns firing together created a cone of destruction that was almost impossible to avoid at close range. American pilots who first saw the Thunderbolt shared the German skepticism. The aircraft they received bore little resemblance to the nimble fighters they had trained on. The cockpit sat so high off the ground that pilots needed a ladder to climb in. Once inside, they found a cockpit spacious enough to move around in, utterly unlike the cramped confines of smaller fighters. The wings seemed too short for the massive fuselage. Taxiing required constant weaving because the long nose completely blocked forward visibility. Veterans of smaller fighters felt like they were flying a delivery truck. The nickname came quickly and stuck permanently. Someone noticed the fuselage profile resembled a milk jug, and the name became universal, the Jug. Pilots said it with a mixture of affection and resignation, the way a soldier might name an ungainly but reliable mule. Other nicknames followed: the Flying Milk Bottle, the 7-ton Milk Jug. Each emphasized the same point. This was not a graceful machine. It was a brute, built for survival. The first combat missions revealed both the aircraft's limitations and its potential. On March 10, 1943, P-47s of the 4th Fighter Group attempted their first fighter sweep over occupied France. The mission was a complete failure. The radios, American models incompatible with the British ground control system, malfunctioned across the entire formation. Pilots could not communicate with each other or with controllers who were supposed to vector them toward enemy aircraft. The entire group had to abort and return to base without encountering the enemy. The radios had to be replaced with British equipment before operations could resume. This humiliating setback reinforced doubts about American equipment and capabilities. The pilots who had volunteered to transfer from the Royal Air Force to the American 8th Air Force wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. The real combat debut came on April 8, 1943. And on April 15th, Major Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group achieved the first P-47 aerial victory, shooting down a Focke-Wulf 190 near Ostend, Belgium. It was an important milestone, proof that the aircraft could kill, but it revealed troubling realities. The Thunderbolt consumed fuel at a prodigious rate, limiting how far it could escort bombers into enemy territory. Early missions could barely reach the German border before having to turn back. Bombers flying deep into Germany went without fighter escort, and the Luftwaffe made them pay terribly for the privilege. German pilots who encountered the new American fighter in those early weeks confirmed their initial impressions. The P-47 could not turn with a Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf. Its roll rate was good, but in sustained turning combat it bled energy rapidly and fell behind. It could not climb with German fighters either. In a zoom climb after a diving pass, the heavy Thunderbolt lost speed faster than its lighter opponents. In a classic dogfight, the kind of swirling, turning combat that had defined air warfare since the First World War, the Thunderbolts seemed hopelessly outclassed. German pilots developed tactics to exploit these weaknesses with brutal efficiency. They would let the Americans dive through their formations, accepting the initial pass, then use their superior climb and turn performance to get behind the Thunderbolts as they tried to escape. Once on the tail of a P-47, a skilled German pilot could stay there indefinitely, pouring fire into the big American fighter until it went down. But something strange began happening. The Americans they shot at would not go down. The incident that changed everything occurred on June 26, 1943. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group was returning from a mission over France when a Focke-Wulf 190 caught him from behind near Forges-les-Eaux. The German pilot was skilled and aggressive, closing to point-blank range and pouring fire into Johnson's Thunderbolt with precision and persistence. Johnson felt the impacts shudder through his aircraft. Cannon shells punched through the fuselage and wings. Machine gun bullets shattered the canopy, sending plexiglass fragments into his face. Fire broke out in the cockpit. Hydraulic fluid sprayed everywhere, soaking his flight suit. Johnson was wounded in the face, hands, and legs. His controls barely responded to his inputs. The aircraft wanted to roll and dive. By every measure of aerial combat, by everything the training manual said about damage and survivability, he should have been dead. The German pilot made pass after pass, emptying his ammunition into the stricken American fighter. Johnson counted the hits as they came. 21 20mm cannon shells tore holes in Johnson's aircraft large enough to put a fist through. Over 200
smaller machine gun bullets added to the destruction. Holes appeared everywhere in the Thunderbolt's skin. Entire sections of the tail and fuselage were shot away. Control surfaces hung in tatters. Yet the engine kept running. The wings stayed attached. The aircraft kept flying. Finally, the German pilot pulled alongside Johnson's shattered cockpit. Through the broken canopy, Johnson could see his enemy clearly, close enough to see the expression on his face. According to Johnson's account, the pilot shook his head in what appeared to be disbelief at what he was witnessing, raised his hand in what Johnson interpreted as a salute of professional respect, and broke away. He had exhausted every round of ammunition he carried against an aircraft that refused to die. The identity of this German pilot remains unknown despite decades of research, though some historians have suggested he may have been from the second group of Jagdgeschwader 26. Johnson nursed his crippled Thunderbolt back across the English Channel, fighting the controls every mile. The aircraft wanted to spiral and dive, and only constant pressure on the stick kept it level. He could not lower his landing gear because the hydraulics had been shot away. He landed gear up at his base in England, sliding across the grass in a shower of sparks. Ground crews counted the holes in his aircraft and could not believe anyone had survived. The Thunderbolt was so badly damaged it had to be scrapped, but they photographed it extensively first. The images became famous throughout both air forces. Johnson walked away from a plane that had absorbed more damage than seemed physically possible. His aircraft, a P-47C2 with the serial number 416235, had proved something that changed the entire air war. The story spread rapidly. American pilots began to understand what they had. The Thunderbolt was not a dogfighter. It was not designed to turn and climb with Messerschmitts. It was something else entirely. It was a flying tank, an aerial weapons platform that could absorb punishment beyond imagination and keep fighting. German pilots began to understand what they faced. The aircraft they had dismissed as an ungainly barrel was in fact nearly indestructible. The technical reasons for this survivability became clear through careful analysis. The air-cooled radial engine had no vulnerable coolant system. Liquid-cooled engines like those in the Messerschmitt 109, the P-51 Mustang, and the Spitfire depended on circulating coolant to prevent overheating.
A single bullet through the cooling system, whether it hit the radiator, the lines, or the engine block itself, meant the aircraft was doomed. The coolant would leak out, the engine would overheat, and within minutes it would seize. The R-2800 could lose entire cylinders and keep running. Individual cylinders could be shot completely away, and the remaining 17 would continue to produce power. The aircraft's sheer size distributed vital systems across a larger area than any other fighter. The fuel tanks were spread throughout the aircraft rather than concentrated. The control cables ran through protected channels with redundant routing. The pilot sat behind armor plate and self-sealing fuel tanks that would plug small-caliber holes automatically. The structure itself was massively overbuilt by European standards, designed to withstand the stresses of high-speed diving that would tear lighter aircraft apart. German pilots adapted their tactics, concentrating fire and attacking in groups to overwhelm the American fighters' defenses. But the fundamental problem remained. They could hit the Thunderbolt repeatedly. They could damage it badly enough that it trailed smoke and fluid across the sky. But killing it required concentrated, sustained fire that exposed the attacker to the 8-gun battery of the aircraft they were trying to destroy. Many German pilots discovered too late that a damaged Thunderbolt could still shoot back. The transformation of the P-47 from struggling newcomer to dominant predator happened through institutional learning on a scale the Germans could not match. American commanders studied every mission, analyzed every encounter, and fed lessons back to both operational units and training establishments. Tactics that worked were documented and distributed. Tactics that failed were analyzed and discarded. The feedback loop between combat and training operated continuously, improving both with each iteration. The introduction of external drop tanks extended range dramatically and changed the strategic equation. The belly-mounted tanks added enough fuel for deep penetration missions. On July 28, 1943, P-47s reached the German border for the first time using 200-gallon pressurized belly tanks. Later, under-wing drop tanks in various sizes extended range even further. The Thunderbolt that could barely escort bombers past the French coast in April was reaching into Germany itself. By autumn, the pilots learned to fight to the Thunderbolt's strengths instead of against them. The aircraft could dive faster than anything in the sky, exceeding 500 miles per hour in a powered descent. This was faster than the speed of sound at sea level, though at altitude, the thinner air meant the actual speed remained subsonic. German fighters could not follow without experiencing compressibility effects that locked their controls and made recovery nearly impossible. Thunderbolt pilots developed tactics that converted altitude into speed, diving through enemy formations with guns blazing, then using that speed to zoom back up to altitude before the Germans could react. The 56th Fighter Group became the proving ground for these tactics. Under Colonel Hubert Zemke, the unit developed aggressive techniques that maximized the Thunderbolt's advantages. Zemke was a demanding commander who drilled his pilots relentlessly. He insisted they master the aircraft's quirks and exploit its capabilities rather than fighting it. He developed the concept of fighter sweeps that cleared the sky ahead of bomber formations, engaging German fighters before they could reach the vulnerable bombers.
The group became known as Zika's Wolf Pack, and its kill record climbed steadily throughout 1943 and 1944. The 56th produced more aces than any other fighter group in the 8th Air Force. It was the only group that declined the opportunity to transition to P-51 Mustangs when those aircraft became available. The pilots knew their Thunderbolts, trusted them, and had developed tactics that made them devastating in combat. They saw no reason to change. The aces who emerged from this crucible became legends of American aviation. Francis Gabreski, the son of Polish immigrants from Oil City, Pennsylvania, became the leading American ace in Europe with 28 confirmed aerial victories, all scored in P-47s.
Gabreski had initially struggled, going months without scoring a kill while watching other pilots build their totals, but he persisted, studied the tactics of successful pilots, and developed his own style that emphasized patience and precise gunnery. "Wait till you get them right in the sights," Gabreski advised younger pilots, "then short bursts. There is no use melting your guns." This disciplined approach transformed him into a deadly hunter. He flew over 150 combat missions, an extraordinary total that reflected both his skill and his luck. His luck ran out on July 20, 1944, when his propeller struck the ground during a strafing pass against a German airfield near Bassenheim. Gabreski survived the crash and evaded capture for 5 days before German forces found him. He spent the rest of the war in Stalag. He later proved his skills were not platform-dependent by scoring 6.5 additional victories, flying F-86 Sabres in Korea, becoming one of only 7 American pilots to achieve ace status in 2 wars. Robert S. Johnson, the pilot who survived the June 26th attack, went on to score 27 confirmed victories, second only to Gabreski among European theater P-47 aces. He became the first American pilot in Europe to surpass Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 kills, a milestone that made national news in America. Johnson's combat philosophy emphasized the Thunderbolt's strengths rather than lamenting its weaknesses. The P-47 was faster, he later said in an interview with a military history publication. It just did not have the climb and range the Mustang did, but it had speed, roll, dive, and the necessary ruggedness. This pragmatic assessment captured what made successful Thunderbolt pilots effective. They accepted the aircraft's limitations and built their tactics around its strengths. In the Pacific theater, Colonel Neel Kearby demonstrated the Thunderbolt's effectiveness against Japanese aircraft, which were even more lightly built than German fighters. On October 11, 1943, Kearby led a flight of 4 P-47s against a formation of approximately 48 Japanese fighters near Wewak, New Guinea. The Americans had altitude advantage, and Kearby led them in a diving attack that scattered the Japanese formation. In 15 minutes of furious combat, Kearby personally shot down 6 enemy aircraft, a single mission record that earned him the Medal of Honor. His tactics exploited the Thunderbolt's devastating diving speed and heavy firepower against a lightly armored Japanese fighters. Where German aircraft could sometimes absorb 50 caliber hits and keep fighting, Japanese fighters often disintegrated under the same punishment. Kearby achieved 22 total victories before his death in combat on March 10, 1944, when his aircraft was shot down during a mission over New Guinea. The numbers told the story of transformation with brutal clarity. By the end of the war, P-47 pilots had claimed 3,752 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat worldwide, across every theater, from Europe to the Pacific to the China-Burma-India region. In the European theater alone, they accounted for over 3,500 Luftwaffe aircraft destroyed. The kill ratio reached 4.6 to 1, 6 to 1, meaning for every Thunderbolt lost in aerial combat, more than 4 enemy aircraft went down. The 8th Air Force's P-47 groups achieved an even more impressive ratio, approaching 7 to 1. Even more remarkably, the Thunderbolt's ruggedness translated directly into pilots surviving to fly again, accumulating experience that made them more deadly with each mission. But the Thunderbolt's greatest contribution came not in high air-to-air combat, but in a role its designers never anticipated. As the P-51 Mustang arrived in numbers during late 1943 and 1944, its superior range made it the preferred bomber escort for deep penetration missions into Germany. The Mustang could fly to Berlin and back, staying with the bombers throughout their mission. The Thunderbolt, with its shorter range, even with external tanks, was increasingly assigned to tactical operations. This apparent demotion actually revealed the aircraft's true calling. The same characteristics that made the Thunderbolt nearly impossible to shoot down made it devastating in the ground attack role. Its air-cooled engine shrugged off the small arms fire and light flak that shredded liquid-cooled fighters attacking at low altitude. A single rifle bullet through a Mustang's belly-mounted radiator meant a dead engine within minutes. The Thunderbolt's radial engine could absorb dozens of such hits and keep running. Its 8-gun battery could destroy anything that moved on the ground. Trucks, trains, armored vehicles, artillery pieces, even tanks fell victim to the concentrated firepower of a strafing Thunderbolt. Later variants added bomb racks and rocket rails that transformed the fighter into a true fighter bomber. Each Thunderbolt could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs on wing and belly hardpoints, plus 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets. This ordnance load exceeded what many dedicated light bombers carried. A flight of 4 Thunderbolts could deliver more explosives on a target than a formation of medium bombers, with greater accuracy and the ability to make repeated passes. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, Thunderbolts from both the 8th and 9th Air Forces flew multiple missions that day, taking off before dawn to provide cover for the landing forces as first light broke over the beaches. Gabreski, flying one of those early missions, later recalled the sight that greeted him as the sun rose. The water was literally covered with ships between England and France.
He remembered it as one of the most spectacular sights I have ever seen. Thousands of vessels, from massive battleships to tiny landing craft, formed a bridge of steel across the English Channel. Above them, Allied fighters maintained a protective umbrella that kept the Luftwaffe at bay. The German Air Force was virtually absent that historic day. Only 2 German fighters, piloted by Josef Prill and Heinz Wojtaszek of Jagdgeschwader 26, actually reached the beaches. Dozens of others attempting to reach the landing areas were destroyed by Allied fighters before they could threaten the vulnerable troops below. The air superiority that allowed this was built on years of attrition of Thunderbolts and Mustangs, grinding down the Luftwaffe until it could no longer contest the skies over France. In the weeks following the invasion, P-47s became the scourge of German ground forces trying to reinforce or retreat from Normandy. Every road and rail line in France became a hunting ground for American fighters. The Falaise Pocket in August 1944 demonstrated the Thunderbolt's destructive potential in graphic and terrible fashion. On August 13th, 37 pilots from the 36th Fighter Group discovered between 800 and 1,000 enemy vehicles trapped on roads west of Argenton. The Germans were trying to escape the closing Allied trap, but the roads were jammed with trucks, tanks, artillery pieces, and horse-drawn wagons in a massive traffic jam that stretched for miles. The Thunderbolts attacked continuously for hours, strafing and bombing until their ammunition was exhausted, then returning to base to rearm and attack again. By the time they finished, the pilots claimed 400 to 500 vehicles destroyed in a single afternoon. The roads were choked with burning wreckage. At Arny on July 29th, the 405th Fighter Group caught another trapped German column and claimed 66 tanks, 204 vehicles, and 11 guns destroyed during a single 6.5-hour assault. The actual numbers destroyed may have been lower than pilot claims suggested, as wartime verification was nearly impossible, but the impact on German operations was undeniable. The Luftwaffe's desperate attempt to reverse the tide came on January 1, 1945, in Operation Bodenplatte. In a massive surprise attack timed to coincide with the Ardennes offensive, German fighters struck Allied airfields across Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The attacks achieved tactical surprise on several fields, catching aircraft on the ground and destroying them before they could take off. At the Y-34 airfield near Metz, aircraft from Jagdgeschwader 53 caught the 365th Fighter Group completely off guard. 22 Thunderbolts were destroyed on the ground and 11 others badly damaged in the attack. It was the worst single-day loss for a P-47 unit in the entire war. But the operation that was supposed to cripple Allied air power instead demonstrated how thoroughly the balance had shifted. At Asch in Belgium, the 352nd Fighter Group, equipped with P-51 Mustangs, was prepared when German fighters appeared over the field.
Squadron Commander John C. Murr had studied intelligence suggesting the Germans might attempt something desperate, and he had 12 aircraft armed and ready for immediate takeoff. In the ensuing battle, Meyer's pilots shot down nearly half the attacking force without losing a single aircraft. The group earned the French Croix de Guerre with Palm for its performance that morning. Across all the attacked airfields, German losses exceeded 270 aircraft destroyed, including many experienced pilots who could not be replaced. The Luftwaffe never recovered from Bodenplatte. The attack, intended to restore German air superiority, instead consumed the last reserves of trained pilots. A captured German prisoner at Metz pointed at the smoking wreckage of American Thunderbolts destroyed in the morning attack and asked his captives what they thought of that. Days later, factory-fresh P-47s arrived as replacements from depots in England. Within a week, the 365th Fighter Group was back to full strength, flying missions as if nothing had happened. When the interrogator turned the question back on the prisoner, the German's reply captured the strategic reality perfectly. That, he said, is what is beating us. American factories transformed the P-47 from an experimental prototype into an avalanche of air power that could absorb any loss and keep coming. Republic Aviation's main plant at Farmingdale, Long Island, produced the majority of aircraft, but demand necessitated expansion to a second facility in Evansville, Indiana. At peak production, the combined facilities churned out 28 aircraft per day, more than one per hour around the clock. Total production reached 15,683 aircraft, more than any other American fighter of the war. The Evansville plant alone produced 6,242 Thunderbolts, roughly 40% of the total output. This dispersed production ensured that no single disaster could throttle the supply of aircraft to combat units. The P-47D became the most numerous variant, with 12,558 built across 29 different production blocks. Each block incorporated improvements based on combat experience and manufacturing refinements. The transition from the original Razorback rear fuselage to the teardrop bubble canopy introduced in the D-25 variant dramatically improved rearward visibility that had been a dangerous blind spot in earlier aircraft. High-speed P-47M variants achieved 473 miles per hour in level flight, fast enough to catch German V-1 flying bombs and the new jet fighters that began appearing in late 1944. Long-range P-47N variants featured redesigned wings with internal fuel capacity of 556 gallons for Pacific operations, where the vast distances between islands demanded extreme range. Production efficiency drove down costs dramatically as the factories learned their craft. Early Thunderbolts cost approximately $113,000 each. By 1945, the price had fallen to $83,000, a reduction of over 25%. This remained more expensive than the P-51 Mustang at $51,000 to $58,000, reflecting the Thunderbolt's greater size, more powerful engine, and heavier armament. But the cost per mission, accounting for survivability and return rate, told a different and more favorable story. The Thunderbolt served not only American forces but allies around the world through the Lend-Lease program. The Royal Air Force received over 800 Thunderbolts, operating 16 squadrons, primarily in Burma and Southeast Asia, where its ruggedness proved invaluable in jungle conditions that corroded and degraded more delicate aircraft. Brazil's first fighter group flew 445 combat missions in Italy, proving that pilots from South America could master the demanding aircraft as well as anyone. Mexico's 201st Fighter Squadron completed 791 sorties in the Philippines without losing a single aircraft or pilot to enemy action, an extraordinary record of effectiveness and survivability. The Soviet Union received approximately 200 Thunderbolts, but found them ill-suited to Red Air Force doctrine, which emphasized low-altitude operations, where the turbo supercharger provided no advantage. At treetop height, the Thunderbolt was a heavy, thirsty aircraft without the high-altitude performance that justified its complexity. The Soviets preferred simpler, lighter fighters better suited to their style of warfare. This illustrated an important truth about the aircraft. The Thunderbolt was not a universal solution. It was optimized for a specific type of warfare, high-altitude escort and ground attack, and it excelled at that mission beyond anything else available.
The debate over the P-47 versus the P-51 Mustang occupied wartime strategists and continues among historians today. German prisoner pilots interrogated after capture rated the Mustang the best overall American fighter, respecting its speed, range, and agility while noting its vulnerability to cannon fire. The liquid-cooled engine that gave the Mustang its sleek lines gave it a fatal weakness. The same prisoners described the Thunderbolt as admirable for its ruggedness and superb diving speed, an aircraft that could absorb tremendous punishment and remain airborne. The consensus that emerged from these interrogations acknowledged both aircraft as essential to Allied victory, their strengths complementary rather than competing. The 56th Fighter Group's decision to retain P-47s throughout the war, unique among ETO Air Force fighter groups, reflected this understanding. When offered the chance to transition to Mustangs as other groups were doing, Zime's Wolfpack declined. They had mastered the Thunderbolt, developed tactics that exploited its capabilities, and achieved a kill record that spoke for itself. The group finished the war with over 665 aerial victories, plus over 300 aircraft destroyed on the ground, one of the highest totals of any fighter unit in any air force in any theater. As the war ended, the Thunderbolts that had ruled European and Pacific skies faded quickly from service. Jet aircraft made piston engine fighters obsolete almost overnight.
The last P-47 rolled off the production line in December 1945. Within a few years, most had been scrapped, their aluminum melted down for civilian use or sold to foreign air forces at bargain prices. The factories that had produced them at the rate of nearly one per hour converted to civilian production or closed entirely. The pilots who had flown them scattered back to civilian life. Gabreski became a career Air Force officer, commanding wings in Korea and Vietnam before retiring as a colonel. Johnson left the service to become an insurance executive, rarely speaking publicly about his wartime experiences. Zena retired as a colonel after a distinguished post-war career. The men who had proven the doubters wrong, who had turned a flying milk jug into a weapon of decisive importance, returned to ordinary lives with ordinary jobs and ordinary concerns. The aircraft themselves became increasingly rare. Of 15,683 built, fewer than 20 survive today in flying condition. A few more exist in museums, their olive drab paint faded, their guns empty, their engines silent. The Smithsonian Institution displays one at its facility in Virginia. Others can be found at air museums across America and around the world. Visitors walk past them without understanding what they represent, what they accomplished, what they meant to the men who flew them and the nations they defended. The lesson of the P-47 Thunderbolt is not simply a story of an effective weapon. It is a story about the danger of assumptions, about what happens when experts measure potential by current performance rather than underlying capability. German pilots looked at the Thunderbolt and saw what they expected to see, an ungainly aircraft that could not compete with their sleek fighters in traditional combat. They did not see the engineering philosophy that prioritized survival over agility. They did not see the industrial capacity that could absorb losses and keep producing. They did not see the institutional learning that transformed initial failures into refined tactics. They made the same mistake their leaders made about America itself. They saw a nation that had not mobilized for war and concluded it could not mobilize. They saw factories making consumer goods and assumed those factories could not make weapons. They saw diversity and believed diversity meant weakness. Each assumption was tested by reality. Each assumption proved wrong. Each error contributed to their ultimate defeat. The men who built the Thunderbolt understood something profound about modern warfare. They understood that combat is not a duel between champions, but a grinding contest of attrition. The aircraft that survives to fight again is more valuable than the aircraft that wins brilliantly but dies in the process. The pilot who returns from every mission accumulates experience that makes him deadlier each time. The factory that produces reliable machines in overwhelming numbers matters more than the workshop that crafts exquisite prototypes. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian immigrant who conceived the Thunderbolt during a train ride back to New York, died in 1974. Largely forgotten by the public he had helped defend, his aircraft had destroyed more enemy planes than any other American fighter. It had delivered more ordnance against enemy ground forces than any other fighter in the European theater. It had brought more pilots home alive than any comparable aircraft on any side of the conflict. But history often remembers elegance over effectiveness. The sleek Mustang, the elegant Spitfire, the deadly Zero capture the imagination in ways the ungainly Thunderbolt does not. The Jug, the flying milk bottle, the aircraft that looked like a dinosaur but fought with devastating effectiveness, fades from popular memory, even as its record stands unchallenged. Perhaps that is fitting. The Thunderbolt was never meant to be beautiful. It was meant to work. It was meant to take punishment that would destroy other aircraft and keep flying. It was meant to put 8 streams of .50 caliber fire on target and let the pilot live to do it again tomorrow. By every measure that actually mattered in the brutal calculus of war, it succeeded beyond what anyone had the right to expect. The numbers remain staggering even 8 decades later. Over 746,000 combat sorties flown. Over 132,000 tons of bombs dropped on enemy positions. Thousands of locomotives, tens of thousands of vehicles, countless defensive positions destroyed or damaged. These statistics represent not abstract figures, but the systematic dismantling of the enemy's ability to wage war. Every train that did not reach the front carried supplies that German soldiers never received. Every truck destroyed on a French road was ammunition or food or reinforcements that never arrived. The Thunderbolt did not win the war alone, but it made winning possible in ways that cannot be measured simply by counting aerial victories. The German pilots who laughed at the flying barrel in 1943 were not laughing in 1945. By then, those who survived understood what they faced. They understood that the ungainly American fighter embodied everything they had failed to anticipate about their enemy. Industrial might that could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. Engineering pragmatism that valued survival over specifications. The ability to absorb initial failures and improve systematically. The willingness to sacrifice elegance for effectiveness. The Thunderbolt was America's answer to the Luftwaffe, and the answer was devastating. The history you just heard carries lessons that echo into our present day. Nations still make the mistake of seeing what they expect to see, rather than what actually exists. Leaders still dismiss capabilities they do not understand. Intelligence analysts still measure potential by current performance rather than underlying capacity. The cost of such misjudgment remains as high as ever. The Thunderbolt reminds us that first impressions deceive, that appearance does not equal capability, and that the practical solution that works will always defeat the elegant solution that fails. It reminds us that wars are won by systems, by the ability to produce, to train, to learn, and to persist. Most importantly, it reminds us never to underestimate an opponent simply because they do not match our expectations. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. We would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts, and you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.